I'm Valerie Sayers, the chair of the English department, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Terry Eagleton back to Notre Dame, where he's in residence for 3 weeks every semester, and where his public lectures offer the opportunity to point out that in a profession where literary critics' admirers are most likely to be other specialists, Eagleton is actually read by our colleagues in other disciplines and even by the public. He's been called our most influential living critic and wears that praise with a cloak of irony Oscar Wilde would surely have approved. His work is notable for an uncommon degree of clarity and especially for his wit. He's deployed that wit to especially good effect in recent years when he has deftly answered simplistic attacks on religious belief and has also reminded us how capacious his understanding of faith is. Among his most recent books are Reason, Faith, and Literature, Reflections on the God Debate, Why Marx Was Right, On Evil, The Event of Literature, and How to Read a Poem. His 40-plus books range from theoretical works on aesthetics, sexuality, and postmodernism to a novel, a play, and a film script. He has even written a memoir. Terry Eagleton's intellectual audacity, or what Marina Warner has called his sparkling effrontery, is matched by his political engagement, his willingness to enter the bloodiest of brawls, if only in the metaphorical sense, and his delight in language and literature of all sorts. To this culture, our culture, the culture he accuses of pathological upbeatness, he gives us the downbeat promise of today's lecture, entitled The End of the Humanities. Please join me in welcoming Terry Eagleton back to Notre Dame.
A year or so ago, I was shown around what I believe is the largest university in southern Asia by its proud president, a man who was flanked by two grin-faced young heavies in black suits and shades, and for all I know with concealed Kalashnikovs. Once he'd done singing the praises of his sublime business school and magnificent managerial centre and transcendently forward-looking technology studies, I asked him why there seemed to be no critical studies in this otherwise utopian cutting-edge setup. He looked at me as though I'd asked him how many PhDs in pole dancing they awarded each year. He replied in a rather strangulated tone, "Your comment will be noted." His two young heavies shifted uneasily, his sides glinting at me through their shades and probably moving their Kalashnikovs into a more operative situation, whereupon the president himself flicked open a gleaming little technological device. He appeared from nowhere and muttered into it two words in Korean, probably "kill him." After a while, a car the length of a football pitch arrived, probably bulletproof and equipped with a supply of his blood, in case of would-be humanistic assassins, and he was whisked away, no doubt wondering whether every Englishman was as stupid as me. It was all a far cry from my 30 or so years at Oxford University, where typing rather than handwriting a note to one's colleagues was considered incorrigibly vulgar, and where the only technology around the place was a rather ingenious little hoist that would bring the port and Madeira decanters up from the bottomless pantry to the dessert table. I doubt the Korean president would have been greatly impressed by that. What the incident signifies, I suppose, is that we're living at the moment through an event as momentous in its own way as the discovery of penicillin or the melting of the polar ice caps, namely the capitulation, the final capitulation on a global scale of university education to the priorities of advanced capitalism. The final integration of that system having resisted that development myself for some years, I've now finally decided to throw in the towel. It's not possible to fight it, so it's now my practice at the beginning of a class, for example, to ask the students how many of them can afford my $200 insights into the subject, as opposed to one or two mildly intelligent perceptions costing around a quarter of that price. I then divide the class into various sectors, rather like an infant school, according to their ability to pay, and just pace backwards and forwards, talking to each section separately. And for those fanatical Democrats who would dismiss this as odiously hierarchical, I must make it clear that the less well-heeled students are offered an opportunity to put down a deposit on my brightest insights and pay off the rest weekly, or if this proves beyond their slender means, to perform a few little domestic tasks for me in exchange for one or two aperçus about Milton and Proust. I mean, as a radical, I've always been concerned to narrow the gap between academia and everyday life, and having graduate students iron my socks or take out the garbage in return for a little chat about the heroic couplet strikes me as a constructive, even radical move, one might say, in this direction. I'd like, if I can, in this talk, though it might not be easy, to avoid the phrase the crisis of the humanities, not just because it's an obvious cliche, but because there's a sense in which it's a tautology. Rather, you might say, business ethics is an oxymoron. It's a tautology because I suppose there's a sense in which the humanities have always been in a kind of crisis. I mean, crisis and humanities go together like Coke and Charlie Sheen. It's not as though it's not as if we like somehow sentimentally to imagine there was once a formation known as the humanities in full working order, which was then somehow blown off course. On the contrary, it was out of a certain historical crisis, surely, that what we know today as the humanities emerged in the first place. As we know today, the humanities and industrial capitalism were born pretty much at a stroke, pretty much in the same hour. And that was significant because what it meant was that values which could increasingly find less and less place in this acquisitive and possessive individualist social order had really to take up a home elsewhere, to find some kind of refuge. And as the 19th century drew on, this protected enclave went under a whole number of names: Geist, culture, the arts, civilization, literature, and so on. Because it was increasingly structurally distinct from the established social order, it was able to act as a fairly powerful critique of it. There was enough daylight between it and that order for that to happen. But by the same token, this distance generally ensured that the critique was pretty blunted and not very effectual. It was as though the human body had been split down the middle, turned into an efficiently labouring or profit-reaping or self-disciplined instrument on one hand, yet only by virtue of siphoning off all the kinds of energies which were dysfunctional for that end: creative, imaginative, erotic, libidinal, symbolic, spiritual, and so on, into some other sphere altogether. You needed a sphere where, as it were, you could siphon off those increasingly dysfunctional energies and cultivate them behind a kind of cordon sanitaire which insulated them from the contaminating influences of society at large, but which by the same token meant their effectuality was increasingly weakened. The humanities would still, in this situation, continue to give support to a ruling power, but obliquely and indirectly so. Yet another name for this protected enclave was, of course, the university, seen as a centre of humane critique. As its name suggests, it was also a place which sought to provide some general or universal vision of humanity in a social order which was becoming alarmingly specialised and fragmented. And that posed a difficult dilemma for the humanities, because either they could, as it were, be acceptable to its increasingly specialised and fragmented logic by conforming to it themselves, namely by becoming specialist and professionalised, but only perhaps at the cost of risk of losing their cutting edge, or conversely, they could try to preserve something with their more general, universal and humane span and capacity, but only at the cost of a certain disabling amateurism. They never really, I think, has managed to solve that particular problem. At the same time, the arts had come loose increasingly from the social system as a whole. It was increasingly difficult to say what they were for. They couldn't any longer justify their existence in the way that they used to be able to, by, say, flattering the monarch or entertaining the court or playing their part in religious worship or recounting the heroic achievements of the tribe or any of the functions that the arts had in the days when there were jobs for artists. As William Blake recognised, they were now rapidly becoming part of general commodity production, addressed not to God or patron or monarch or community, but to any anonymous consumer on the market with the money to buy them and the taste to appreciate them. However, for a certain vein of radical romanticism, this lack of established function for the arts, this dysfunctionality, their alienation from the social order at large, was exactly the point. On this theory, the point of the arts was to be gloriously pointless. Yes, their relevance lay precisely in their irrelevance in a social order for which nothing without utility could possibly have value. Simply by what they did, simply by what they were, not necessarily by what they said or argued, they posed a living critique to that anemic kind of rationality, that instrumentalist reason or utilitarian rationality. So that, extraordinarily, paradoxically, a new and revolutionary function could be plucked precisely out of the dysfunctionality of the arts, namely the function of critique. For the first time in history, it would seem the arts could be independent enough of power, could be so little servile lackeys of some kind of authority that they could turn upon it and hold it to account. And, of all ironies, it was the market, it was the commodification of art, it was the prizing of it loose from traditional functions which allowed this to happen in the first place. So the virtue could be, as it were, wrested from the jaws of historical necessity, alienation turned to a destructive end, the disabling distance of dysfunctionality converted into the enabling distance of critique or perhaps of spiritual transcendence. The work of art could find a new destiny for itself in resisting the commodity form, which would finally mean that it would have to become opaque and obscure and self-involved and impenetrable and dislocate its syntax and jumble its forms and thicken its textures in order to avoid simply slipping down like the commodity in order to involve being consumed. And the last doomed attempt, I think, of this freedom and autonomy for the arts, this feature of critique, was really what we know as modernism, which, not accidentally, happens at the same moment in the early 20th century that culture itself now becomes a full-blown industry, the emergence of the so-called culture industry, which is born at a stroke with that 11th-hour resistance to the miseries of cultural commodification, which we know as high modernism. Some decades later, in our own time, culture would embrace the process of commodification, however shamefacedly in some cases, become locked into the capitalist social order, become explicitly and self-awarely a part of general commodity production, and since there was now no daylight between itself and that order, and thus no critical distance, abandon its traditional role of humane critique. And it's not anything accidental, but it's more or less at the same historical moment that the universities begin to do much the same. You may know that in Britain the state has now stopped funding the humanities, the government no longer funds the humanities, which are thus almost entirely reliant on student fees. And since the customers, the punters, are now calling shots, one can confidently expect every English course in the United Kingdom from now on to be about vampires. This abrupt cutting of the umbilical cord to the humanities on the part of a Philistine Tory government is particularly scandalous, I think, in a country which has always rightly rejected the appalling idea that education should be a commodity, to be bought and sold, a view which is, of course, alive and kicking where we are at the moment. There are one or two private universities in Britain, I understand, but nobody knows where they are. You find them accidentally by straying off the road at some point in time. It was the state that footed my own education at Cambridge, for which I didn't pay a bean. Admittedly, that was in the period before the Industrial Revolution, when only a tiny elite of people could attend university in Britain. But the same, of course, can easily be done today. Most British students believe quite properly that it's a community's moral duty to educate their young, not to treat it like selling an insurance policy. And if we in Britain could lay our hands on the untold billions stolen from the people in tax evasion and tax avoidance, we'd go some considerable way, I suppose, to financing free education. If this wasn't enough, we could then take the banks into public ownership and rehire their chief executives after a lengthy period of public penance, fasting and self-flagellation as lavatory cleaners, doormen, commissionaires and the like. So they would be a part of their banks altogether. They just don't have the privilege of working for them. There is a tiny class of objects around the place which are, as the jargon has it, autotelic, which have their ends in themselves. The mightiest of these, of course, is God. God has his grounds, ends, reasons, raison d'etre in himself. He is his own ground, reason, end, origin, and so on. That's why he's God. And that's why God is entirely pointless, which of course is a traditional unorthodox theological view. Which is to say that, like a joke or a love lyric, he's his own point. Another of these autotelic phenomena is evil, which seems mysterious not because it's about being very, very wicked. Evil isn't about being very, very wicked. It's a special and gratifyingly extremely rare form of wickedness, which is the obscenely pleasurable orgy of destruction purely for its own sake, without rhyme or reason. There's a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive, well-argued book on this topic called On Evil, written like most such books by myself. To say that God created the universe is not, of course, to say, to talk about how the universe got started. It's not some kind of rival to science, some sort of bogus scientificity, as an old-fashioned 19th century rationalist like Richard Dawkins seemed to imagine. To say that God created the world is to say nothing about how the world got started, of course. The greatest of all theologians, I suppose, Thomas Aquinas, thought it quite conceivable that the universe had no origin at all. He didn't believe that himself, as his mentor Aristotle did, but he thought it was a perfectly reasonable position to take up, that the universe had no origin. But of course he was a devout believer in the doctrine of creation, because the doctrine of creation has nothing to do with the origin of the universe. If anybody, by the way, wants to know what it has to do with, and you don't already, if you just approach me later in private and for a very small sum, we academics have to live. Because God is himself autotelic, because he is entirely pointless, because he has his end in himself, because he doesn't exist for anything, one of the things one means by saying, by talking about creation, is that the world is like that too. The world shares in God's own autotelism, which is to say that it doesn't have a point either, that humanity is gloriously pointless. Atheist and believer are entirely at one in their belief that the world isn't for anything at all. Like God, it exists entirely for its own self-delight, and it's thus much more like a work of art than it is like some cunning piece of manufactured material. God is much more like an artist than like a Victorian manufacturer. The universe itself, then, on the doctrine of creation, is the final refutation of an instrumentalist rationality. Like a work of art, its existence is purely gratuitous. And that is nowhere more obvious than the case of humanity, that particular bit of the universe. Our existence also is gratuitous. That's to say that our being is overshadowed by the perpetual possibility that we might have been in the first place. In some bits of humanity, that takes the form of a fear of death. There's absolutely no need for anything whatsoever. There's no need for the cosmos or humanity. This is part of the doctrine of creation. There's certainly no need for Tom Cruise or Sarah Palin. No doubt were created in that moment of oversight. Just happened to slip out. The doctrine of creation includes the idea that God of course, doesn't have any needs. He doesn't have any, which means, among other things, he has no neurotic possessiveness of his universe. He can just let it be, as if he can let people be. He created it not out of need, but out of love, and he created it gratuitously, out of grace, which is to say, for no reason whatsoever. So it follows from the doctrine of creation, it follows from what you might even call the politics of creation, that human beings are at their finest when they're gloriously pointless, just like the work of art, that the work of art, in a certain understanding of the aesthetic artifact, which we know when it began about 1750, on a certain understanding of the aesthetic artifact, works of art are important because they are paradigms, they're paradigmatic of the self-determining pointlessness of individuals themselves. Men and women have no more need than their creator to justify their existence before some sour-faced tribunal of utility or Geist or history or the greatest happiness or the greatest number or whatever it happens to be. To adopt a technical theological term which you may not be familiar with, they exist just for the hell of it. Or at least they should do. Rather important difference. At the moment, of course, that isn't so, and nor has it been so throughout the history of humanity. So little so, in fact, that the gloomiest philosopher perhaps who ever lived, Arthur Schopenhauer, I always think there's something rather banal about his first name in comparison to the grandeur of his second name, Arthur Schopenhauer. Anyway, Schopenhauer thought that it was utterly mad to imagine, mad in the English, not the American sense, to imagine that that humanity had been worth the trouble at all. He thought it absolutely apparent that it would have been far better if the vast majority of men and women who had ever been born had never been born at all. That their lives of wretched, fruitless toil, largely for the sake of the power and profit of a minority, would certainly have been preferable had they not had to conduct those lives at all. For the what one might call the radical romantic heritage, that's true. Marx describes humanity, history as a nightmare which weighs on the brains of the living. Yes. Nevertheless, it needn't, for the radical romantic heritage, of which Marx is, among other things, a part, it needn't be true in the sense that it may be feasible, there are no guarantees, to create a society in which men and women could realise their energies and powers and capacities. This is the kind of language that Marx uses. Marx, of course, is always talking about individual powers and capacities. He in no sense reifies society. To realise them just for the hell of it, just for the pleasure and delight of it, not for any more utilitarian motive, not for the power and profit of others. It's this essentially aesthetic way of seeing which is Marxist ethics and politics. sharing parties, you don't want to alienate instantly. The only other good reason for being a Marxist is you don't like having to work. So if there's anybody here today who doesn't like having to work, then please sign on as soon as possible. Marxism is about getting rid of the fetish and idolatry of labour. Marx, as a good secular Jew, knows all about idolatry and certainly sees labour, sweated, pointless labour for the sake and profit of others, as being an enormous curse. Suitably reorganised, Marx thinks the fabulous wealth which capitalism has so kindly accumulated for us could be redeployed so that men and women might be, as far as feasible, and he's fairly realistic about this, released from the more degrading forms of toil. At that point, for Marx, authentic human history could begin. Nothing really has happened yet. The only authentic historic event would be for him to leap from the realm of necessity, where we've just rung one dreary, tedious change after another on cycles of exploitation, into the realm of freedom. And what that would look like, of course, Marx has famously or notoriously very little to say, because you can't pre-program, you can't blueprint freedom. Marx is a prophet not in the sense of a clairvoyant seeking to foretell the future. The biblical prophets are not, of course, clairvoyants seeking to foretell the future. They're simply people who tell the present, unless it changes its ways, unless it repairs its injustice, then there isn't going to be a future, or at least if there is, it's going to be pretty unpleasant. Oscar Wilde, to whom Valerie referred in her introduction, shared this vision of Marx. Oscar Wilde is very close to Marx in many ways. He wrote, of course, a magnificent pamphlet called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which was very influential on the British labour movement. And Marx himself, Wilde himself, is a socialist. He was also, of course, an Irish Republican. He's a socialist because he thinks that the best thing to do is to try to reorganise society so that we can, as much as possible, realise our creative powers and capacities in some way other than the pathologically obsessive concern with profit and labour and so on. For Wilde, one imagines the future would consist of us just lying around all day in loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe, reciting Homer to each other, and that, of course, would just be the working day. Describing the leisure activities that would follow. In other words, it's absolutely no accident that Wilde is a socialist as well as an aesthete. Two go right together. Indeed, when Marx himself comes to consider the topic of production, he doesn't think about cotton mills or coal mines, he thinks about art. The model for Marx of production is the work of art, energies expended purely for the delight of it. So that for this radical romantic lineage, there's no need to justify the existence of the humanities any more than there's a need to justify a sob or a smile. Isn't this, though, we might ask, too patrician and privileged a view? Doesn't it smack a bit too much of hoisting those Madeira bottles up from the butler's pantry to the sea of the cauldron? Well, one of the astonishing achievements of the radical romantic tradition, and not least of Wilde, is to convert this plainly privileged view into a more progressive one. That is to say, to rescue it from the history of the aristocracy and actually to turn it into something that might be more available to others. Wilde was perfect in English gentleman, in the way that only one who was neither English perfect nor a gentleman could possibly be. But Wilde saw that an aristocratic version of culture could, on the back of a certain development, a certain material development of production, be recycled in radical or progressive form. And there he was being true to a long tradition of radical romanticism, so that the leisure of a privileged upper class could be, with deliberate perversity, read as prefigurative, as proleptic, of a future in which, given a certain redeployment of material resources, the great majority of men and women relatively free of hard labour. Wilde would no doubt have been properly disgusted by the American Puritan habit of rising at the crack of dawn and going to bed around 9:30, understanding as he did that any truly civilized nation seeks to stay in bed as long as possible in the morning and stay out of it as long as possible at night. Visitors to this great country are always struck by the Puritan compulsion with which people can't stay in bed. That's a lot to do with commerce as well as with Puritanism. However, if the humanities are in big trouble, it's not only because of the philosophism of our redneck rulers. There are certain seismic upheavals within them themselves that have evolved over the 20th century particularly. And I can maybe best summarise that by saying that in late modernity, the humanities, or if you like, culture, have shifted over increasingly from being part of the solution to being part of the problem. And that's another reason for the crisis I'm not going to mention. They thus have a remote resemblance to psychoanalysis, as the German psychologist Karl Kraus saw it, which he memorably described as part of the problem to which it's a solution. What I mean by that is this, that in 19th century Europe, the humanities could be seen as a kind of answer to political conflict and social upheaval. A 19th century Europe, of course, that was never free of the fear of popular revolution, and much of whose culture is deeply shaped and imprinted by that anxiety. The humanities stood for what it meant to be human at a level which was thought to be so fundamental and so fundamentally shared that it cut through our relatively superficial differences and dissensions. And if that was a rather abstract notion, of course, so you needed some way of concretizing it. You needed to make it more palpable and tangible, and the answer to that was the arts, more particularly the flagship of the arts, literature. If literature was important, it wasn't at all because people were fascinated by poetry. It was because the arts were a tangible embodiment of this profound consensus by which one lived, of the values by which one lived. And they were, moreover, a peculiarly portable version of that consensus, of those values. If you wanted your colonial subjects in India or Ireland to know what it meant to be civilized, then you could always hand them a volume of Shakespeare. There it was. You didn't need to give them a lot of tedious sermons. They did that too, of course, but it was much more convenient, labour-saving, just to hand them a volume of Shakespeare. The problem, of course, with this version of common humanity, which in its own way, for all its hopeless idealism, was extremely generous-hearted, very generous-spirited. It looked for what united people rather than divided them. But of course, it could survive only by suspending or suppressing or ignoring the real conflicts and dissensions and differences between people, and that moved increasingly to the fore, I think, as the 20th century unfolded. I mean, for example, the single most supremely successful revolutionary movement of the late modern age, the one that within a very few decades transfigured the face of the earth, far more so than feminism, far more so than socialism, revolutionary nationalism, yes, that was utterly dependent, still is, on certain notions of culture in the broad anthropological rather than the narrow aesthetic sense, ideas of language, symbol, heritage, kinship, tradition, community, custom, practice, all of that, yes. But now culture was now the very medium in which political struggles, political demands were shaped and articulated. It wasn't the answer to them anymore. It didn't try to wheel on stage a consensus that was, as it were, dissolve those conflicts. It was now the very language of culture had become, as it were, the very language of politics itself, and that was to be even more so in the so-called identity politics which followed in the wake of revolutionary nationalism, which I suppose came to an end in the early 1970s. Culture, in other words, was now a terrain of contention, and that was profoundly inimical to a classical conception of culture, the way in which Diderot or Schiller or Matthew Arnold or the early Thomas Mann would have conceived of it. Yes? Because from the standpoint of this more traditional, more liberal humanist conception of culture, the very phrase cultural politics has the ring of an oxymoron, like Texan haute cuisine, Mormon intellectual. Why? Because culture of the humanities had actually constituted themselves for what they were by disowning what they saw as the degraded domain of political conflict or social contention. Now, however, in an alarming transformation, culture became more and more possible to define as what men and women were prepared to kill for. Culture is what people are prepared to kill for, or die for. Right? I mean, nobody could ever be prepared to kill for Balzac or Beethoven, except perhaps for a few seriously weird people hiding out in caves, too ashamed to come out and confess their idiosyncrasies to the rest of us. Now, of course, they were, as we have seen indeed in the tragedy in Boston, that culture is what people are prepared to kill for. I notice, surprisingly, mysteriously, that there are no flags lowered for the innocent civilians, hundreds of them, killed by American drones in Afghanistan, which far outnumber the 2 or 3 people killed in Boston, but maybe that's because we're the good guys. The whole concept of culture and humanities was accordingly revolutionized. They were now traversed by conflict, they were terrains of conflict, and therefore increasingly a certain classical conception of the humanities increasingly became unusable, and it's still not entirely clear, although I'll make a couple of suggestions in a moment, what it could be replaced by. Certainly not by some mindless celebration of difference, as though difference, plurality, multiplicity, diversity, heterogeneity, marginality were ipso facto radical virtues. Of course they aren't. They're the daily fare of advanced capitalism. No mode of production, as Marx was well aware, indeed said, had been more multiple, various, heterogeneous, plural, hybrid, and all of those other posh and fashionable postmodern words than revolution, than that of capitalism. He also thought that no mode of production in history had been more revolutionary. Indeed, of course, Marx is undying in his praise of all that mode of production had achieved. It might be argued that one of the mistakes that the classical liberal humanist conception made, the classical conception of humanities made, was it took common humanity as a kind of given. You just had to dig down far enough beneath the relatively superficial differences, and there you would find it. Whereas perhaps the idea of common humanity should be seen better as a project still to be politically accomplished. There may be no common humanity, but there might be one. Perhaps one should respond to the phrase common humanity then rather as Mahatma Gandhi did famously when asked what he thought of British civilization, and replied that he thought it would be a very good idea. To do that, to see common humanity as a project to be still accomplished, an ongoing project rather than sort of given, would mean, for one thing, reaching beyond a humanism, an existing humanism, which for all its superb, magnificent accomplishments has been both hubristic and self-admiring. It means, for example, accepting the implications of the fact that to be human is in the first place to be animal. It's not an insight particularly welcomed by many brands of humanism. But whatever else, whatever more glamorous and sexy and impressive human beings might be, they are in the first place natural, material, finite, frail, vulnerable objects, and anything more impressive they can get up to has to be negotiated within that context and the limits of that context, as opposed to the idolatry of the American dream, America's love of the idea of infinity, that somehow one can transgress the merely finite, the merely limited, the merely ending in one's endless search for the stars. Man, comments the philosopher Alexander Kojève, man is a fatal disease of the animal. For Thomas Aquinas, human rationality is essentially animal rationality. In other words, Aquinas thinks that we think as we do and feel as we do roughly because of the kind of bodies that we have. If a lion could speak, as Wittgenstein reminds us, we would not be able to understand what it said. Why not? Because it was speaking in some strange lionese. Couldn't we get headphones, perhaps, or an interpreter? No, because a lion's body is so different from ours, its material and practical activities, its material life form, its species being, is different too. And for Wittgenstein, language is essentially, in the end, about all of that. Aquinas might have said the same of an angel. If an angel could speak, we wouldn't be able to understand what he or she said. Aquinas would certainly have believed in the disembodied soul of John Lennon, but he wouldn't have thought it was John Lennon. He would have believed in the disembodied soul of Michael Jackson, but he wouldn't have thought it was Michael Jackson. Identity for Aquinas is corporeal. Yes. Soul, as he says, is the form of the body. Or as Wittgenstein says, if you want an image of the soul, look at the human body. Humanity, for a certain kind of humanism, is that curious creature which has established itself on the basis of a distance from and discerning of its own animality. And the humanities have traditionally reflected something of the spiritual supremacism. For Christian theology, by contrast, history turns on the animality of God, otherwise known as Jesus. The other great defect of this classical conception of the humanities, generous-hearted as it is due to be in so many ways, is it isn't a sufficiently tragic one, which might sound a strange thing to say, so a good dose of suffering will make a man of you and so on, sort of thing the Duke of Edinburgh will probably say. But it isn't sufficiently tragic. Like the United States, which as Valerie mentioned, I believe to be a pathologically affirmative, bright-eyed, square-jawed sort of nation, which tends to sweep failure, loss, breakdown, and death under the carpet and adopt some rather embarrassed euphemisms for these things. It fails to recognize, this version of humanism, or the humanities, fails to recognize that the human is possible only on the basis of the inhuman. In other words, that only through a compact with failure is any authentic humanity finally possible, as the work of Samuel Beckett magnificently dramatizes. For Christianity, the key signifier of human history is the reviled and tortured body of a suspected political criminal. Romans, of course, reserved crucifixion only for those they suspected of being political rebels, who spoke out for justice, whose mission seemed to be have disastrously collapsed around his ears, whose increasingly complete failure, who left Galilee for Jerusalem partly probably because of that, and who, for speaking out for justice, was, as usual, boring old story, done to death by the state. As has been remarked by a theologian much wiser than myself, the meaning of the gospel then is a very cheerful one, kind of thing one should accompany with guitars and manic grins. If you don't laugh, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. There's your pie in the sky. There's your consolation. There's your opium of the people. For a tragic humanism, only by trying to stare the Gorgon's head of the real in the eyes without being turned to stone by it, if that's possible, who knows, but only by dint of that could there be any hope of resurrection. Only if this frightful trauma is acknowledged as the last word, might it prove not to be. It won't prove to be the last word. It won't prove to be redemptive if you keep trying to peer beyond it to something a little more cheerful. Otherwise, you buy your affirmation on the cheap. I mean, if Jesus had thought to himself, oh well, only a few hours up here on the cross, and then 3 days in the tomb, and then the eternity of bliss, I'm up for that. Doesn't sound too bad. There's much worse bargains. If he had thought of that himself, he of course would most certainly not have been raised from the dead. It's because he lived his death to the full, in all of its agony and apparent futility, while earth was this absurd thing happening to him, went all the way through his radical self-dispossession, that he was able, with no guarantees, to emerge somewhere on the other side. And that's what I mean by tragic humanism. Only by accepting death as a real limit can it become a horizon. Which is to say that Calvary was a genuinely tragic action. It fulfills all the traditional criteria for that. It didn't, of course, end badly, according to Christian belief, but then neither does tragedy necessarily end badly. The Oresteia doesn't end badly. Many Shakespeare tragedies don't end with death, but with a degree of new life. Tragedy doesn't mean comes to a sticky end. It means has to be hauled through hell if there's to be any chance at all of redemption. And of course, as with King Lear and many other tragic protagonists, there is no redemption, as far as we can see, and there are no guarantees. As Marx comments, only by a loss of humanity can there be renewal of it. And that itself is a tragic fact, as Marx recognises. Would that were not so. Would that a painful, radical self-dispossession were not the prelude to new life. But such is the crookedness of humanity that only by virtue of the breaking can there be a remaking. I suppose that's the message of tragic humanism, a message on which Marxism, Christianity and psychoanalysis are all agreed on their very different levels and in their very different ways. And that has not been, by and large, I think, the conventional liberal humanist understanding of humanity, and thus it's not been the dominant tone of the Western humanities. It's far too bleak, extremist, uncomfortable, and uncongenial for that. On the whole, the humanities are not exactly rushed to acknowledge that their obscene underside has always been violence, misery, and exploitation. For every great medieval cathedral, a pit of bones. For every great Victorian poet, the maidservants who heated his bathwater. A humanities that could confront this unpalatable truth and reconstitute itself in the light of it might really be worth fighting for, but first we would have to stretch that Korean president on the earth and run him over with his own limousine. There you are. All right, we have some time for discussion if anybody would like to chip in. Yes.
Since nobody else is willing, I'm still thinking, but since nobody else is standing up, I'll keep the ball rolling because everything you're saying really strikes many very deep chords in me, and I'm wondering if you feel that we are now at this moment at a time when facing bleakness is the path, that if we can take that path and truly move into that realm towards which you pointed, that we could have a rebirth. Are we approaching a time when we can actually think like that? Or are we approaching a time when we'll once again back off into the kinds of feel-good versions that you anatomize so well?
Well, I don't know. I hope we are. And certainly, I think you're right. The bleak acknowledgement is the necessary prelude, the sine qua non of any such advance, I think. Let me put it this way, as far as, say, faith, hope, and bleakness are concerned. Just take the issue of so-called terrorism, which is, of course, much in the news in the States today. So much so, I think that if a world war had broken out last week, America would not have noticed. Not noticed, yeah. The only answer to terrorism, of course, in the end, is justice. The answer to terrorism is justice. But it may be too late for that. Who knows? Yes. I mean, it's easy to say, isn't it, that to try to make reparation for what people regard as their humiliation and oppression over many years, yes, might, well, certainly we know that without that we're not going to make much progress, so that will be an example perhaps of trying to look the real in the eyes as far as one can, but once again, realistically speaking, with no guarantees, it may be too late because of course violence, whether from the West in Afghanistan or from terrorists from the Middle East, violence assumes a deadly momentum of its own, which is very, very, very hard to control. But I think that, you see, I heard somebody on CNN the other day. I wonder when they're going to start talking about this, by the way. I heard somebody say, what they're doing now, of course, is the usual trick of psychologizing it all away. It's nothing political. It's about the fact that these two young men may have had something dreadful in their personal backgrounds. Perhaps they were dropped on their heads at the age of 5 or something. Anyway, somebody said that. Is there some trauma in the background of this young man that would explain the inexplicable things he does? Yes, he's done. Because of course it's inexplicable that anybody should set out to kill innocent civilians, except when the West does it in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then it's not inexplicable at all. But when they do it, it's said to be inexplicable. Well, yes, I suppose the answer is there is a trauma in his background, which is called Western foreign policy. Now, however deludedly and wickedly he may act upon it, and to kill the innocent, of course, is always wicked, that's the answer. I mean, I lived through years and years in which people in Britain and in Ireland where I lived said, what is it that motivates the IRA? I mean, are they just madmen? Does somebody drop them on their heads in infancy? No, perfect. British intelligence didn't think that for a moment. British intelligence knew they had perfectly, from their own viewpoint, rational reasons for complaining about what they saw as British imperialism, whatever awful things they did. And until one understands that, you're not going to get anywhere. If it's convenient to caricature the enemy, it makes you feel better. How could they possibly have any rational grievance against us? We're the good guys. Yeah? But they do, and they may be right or they may be wrong. And they may act on it in atrocious ways or not in atrocious ways. We have to understand that. When I thought to myself, yes, he does have a trauma in his background, namely Western foreign policy, what I meant was something quite precise. I didn't just mean that as some kind of, cheap leftist slur. I'm very much given to cheap leftist slurs. I do it all the time. I've been doing it, most of the afternoon, as you know. Nevertheless, just be that. I meant that in the middle decades of the 20th century, Western foreign policy increasingly rolled back and subordinated, and in some cases smashed entirely, more progressive, liberal nationalist or revolutionary nationalist or leftist or secularist or anti-Islamist forces in the Middle East. Yes? The CIA had a hand in killing, 500,000 communists in Indonesia. Yeah? Once it had created a vacuum in which people in those countries then despaired of these particular forces, no faith in those people, you had a situation in which a very ugly form of radical Islamism could rush, and did, yes, and has. But you can't get anywhere without recognising our own partial responsibility in terms of the foreign policy actions we undertook some decades ago for creating that vacuum. It didn't come from nowhere, you know? And it didn't just come from our policy either. But our policy was one of the factors at stake. And all I mean is, if we are able somehow to face the reality of that, then there may be some hope. I'm pretty convinced that if we go on suppressing that, then we can't. At the end of the Tempest, there is, of course, a marvellous moment in which Prospero turns to the ugly, misshapen, deformed Caliban and says, "This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine." And that is the moment known theologically as repentance. To see in the thing of darkness one's own distorted visage. Not simply to cast it out of the doors, to see one's own visage in that. Now, I'm not arguing that Islamist terrorism is purely and completely a product of the West, far from it. And people who kill other people and blow the heads off innocent people are responsible for that. But unless we can acknowledge our partial responsibility for that monstrosity at the gates, and a monstrosity at the gates is a current image through Western tragedy, I just think that we're not going to get very much further. And that would be a great pity, because then more people are likely to die. Yes?
You briefly mentioned that God's existence and human existence is pointless. And so, are you then implying that the existential dilemma, meaning or purpose, is in a social construct?
No, I don't think it follows from saying that God is gloriously pointless that meaning is just a social construct. I mean, meaning may or may not be a social construct, depending on what one means by that. But I don't think there's a logical connection between those two. For example, what I mean is, you can still believe with impeccable theological orthodoxy that God, creation, and humanity are completely pointless, yes, completely useless. Yes. And nevertheless believe in something you might call inherent meanings. Yes. I take it that the Existentialist project, among other things, doesn't believe in inherent meanings. Yes. In other words, no particular epistemology of that kind or ethics of that kind seems to be follows from, whether you believe that it's from the version of creation that I've been trying to put forward. Yes. I'm never quite sure what people mean by saying that meanings are social constructs. Actually, in one sense, it's almost palpably true, and in another sense, it's very strange. Mount Everest isn't a cultural construct, and neither is a circulation of blood. It all reflects humanists' distance from materiality. Yeah. Of course, the phrase Mount Everest and the phrase circulation of blood are social constructs, but that doesn't cancel my point at all. Yes. What I said about the way in which a certain kind of humanism can establish itself, it seems, only by dint of repressing and distancing a certain animality, as to say the human becomes almost the opposite of the material, is the case in point. Yes. People in the humanities, particularly postmodern people in the humanities, tend to like the idea of social constructs, because social constructs seem more changeable and flexible, yes, than the inertly, materially, and naturally given. That assumes, falsely, that changeability is always a virtue, or that the inertly and total and permanently given is a vice. But of course it's not true, is it? And there are all kinds of change which is deeply unwelcome. Samuel Johnson thought all change was a great evil. Yes? And there are all kinds of permanent facts about, relatively permanent facts, that, that one deeply desires will carry on just as they are. I hope, the present restriction on just taking out all academics over the age of 65 and executing them summarily will continue. I really don't want any flexible, supple, pluralistic, malleable, protean-like approach to it as the postmodernists do. I hope that if we do manage to establish a semblance of justice, then it will be a permanent fact. It won't give way to some fashionable social reconstruction the day after. Yes. It's an extraordinary way in which advanced capitalism encourages us to think of the new, the innovative, the plural, the flexible, as virtues per se. Virtues per se. Of course, change can be a virtue, but it can also be a vice. Even that symbol of our perishability and mortality, the body, I always advise my postgraduate students that they have to have the word body in their title of their books, otherwise they just won't get published. In my day it was dialectics. Body. But even that symbol of our frailty and vulnerability and perishability of the body has, as it were, to be immortalized by, since we can't literally immortalize it yet, anyway, though I'm sure Michael Jackson was working on it, immortalized by repressing its finitude, so that even the body becomes a piece of discourse. Yes, and a piece of discourse is notoriously more malleable and flexible and so on. Or simply by, turning the whole of late capitalist reality into an enormous tattoo parlor, an enormous cosmetic surgery, in which the point of having a body is to have it pummeled around from week to week in whatever shape takes your fancy. Yes. The body has to be repressed in this way. It doesn't sound like repression. It is, because it's just a sign of our materiality and perishability. And if we have a civilization that thinks it can control or wants to control more or less everything, then death is bound to be a scandal to it. Because so far at least we can't. Yes?
Yes, I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on virtual world as a potential for the death of the humanities, or maybe a possibility for the cause of the rebirth of humanities.
Virtual world. I sort of predate virtual world. Well, actually, I predate the typewriter.
Check your smartphone.
Sorry, Jim?
Check your smartphone. Make it from. Look it up.
I'm afraid, ignorance has never deterred me from anything. There are times when you have to confess. Well, you see, virtual world is actually a very old idea, isn't it? In the sense of talking about fictionality. We're just talking now about a certain kind of technological fictionality, but virtual worlds, imagined worlds, subjunctive worlds, of course, are very old. One of the mistakes of romanticism, perhaps, is to imagine that the subjunctive should always trump the indicative. That is to say that what could be is always going to be more valuable than what is. That's true if you're thinking of Donald Trump, for example, but not if you're thinking of Nelson Mandela. So virtuality in that sense, of course, is a prime component of art and symbolic worlds. Yes. I'm not sure that I'm sure one can do all kinds of fancy things with that, technologically speaking, but the idea is really pretty old. Yes.
Do you feel that the fact that the humanities and the material world have become so interwoven in our modern society takes away the humanities' ability to have any effect upon the material world in our modern society? Do you feel it's lost its potency?
Yeah. Well, in one sense, what I'm complaining about, I suppose, is that the humanities and materiality haven't been close enough. And I've been talking about the animality of the species and so on. Yes. So there's been, if you like, the technical word for that is idealism. kind of idealism dissociates itself from the, as it were, the material basis of argument. But, and certainly the materialization of culture, technologization of culture, has been a sort of scandal, a very useful scandal, to a certain rather idealist conception of humanity. Think, for example, and don't just think of computers, think of the great revolutionary avant-gardes of the 20th century, from futurism, constructivism, surrealism, dadaism, whose scandal to bourgeois culture, if you like, was, among other things, the fact that culture was now a set of material instruments or techniques or practices or institutions, from film and photography to new kinds of theatre and so on. That is to say, the avant-garde made a rather perilous wager. It said we might be able to seize on modern technology and use it for political ends which are alien to that technology. We might be able to turn it somehow against it, to some degree, of course. If you think of Eisenstein and Brecht and Mayakovsky and many others, they did. Yes? That whole emphasis on the left, that culture was a set of material institutions and relations and not just a set of fancy ideas, was profoundly radical, I think, at its time. At the same time, that can be accompanied by a certain a heresy well known to Marxism as technologism. That's to say, the belief that technology in and by itself has a certain kind of progressive or emancipatory virtue. And that's clearly not the case. I mean, the same technology can be used in very different ways, ethically and politically, depending on the context. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, they offered a job to Erwin Piscator, the great Brecht's great comrade, and indeed mentor, Marxist theatre director, yeah? Because they saw that, of course, all of those avant-garde theatrical techniques could be equally well harnessed to fascist ends. There was nothing intrinsic in the technology which said it will go this way politically or that, and I suppose there's something similar in the internet. I mean, not that I've ever used the internet, really. Probably the last person on the planet, and certainly the last person in this room and this country that has never used the internet and never sent an email. Yes, never in my life. I'm okay, look, I'm still walking. I still have my heart and legs, and, and everything. Thank you. So it's a matter of, technologism takes technology out of its historical context and tries to evaluate it as a thing in itself, and that one should guard against us. Okay. Yeah.
I was a bit worried about the Koreans in your example.
About the Koreans?
The Koreans,
yeah.
Which seem to maybe suggest that a bad Asian copy of Western capitalism is going to destroy the humanities. And I read recently in the New York Times about destruction of humanities for us, by our indigenous ruling classes, the Tories you point to as one example. And indeed, the humanities courses are encouraged now in China, which begs the question of maybe the humanities have always offered cultural legitimacy to political domination. So I was wondering if you could.
Yes. No, I take your point about the Korean example. I mean, this, as I said, is a global phenomenon, isn't it? Really? And there are pockets of resistance to it. When I go to South Africa, people talk about what they call the Thatcherization of the universities under the ANC. I mean, this is by no means confined to them. It is true that, as you say, that culture has very often helped to legitimate, I won't say power, because some leftists have an annoying habit of talking about power as though it's negative. Whereas I mean, power is an excellent thing. Personally, I can't get enough of it. It's an extraordinary way in which when the left said, or the postmodernists where it says power, they always do negative power. But without power, you can't do anything. You can't unseat tyrants or dominant power. Yes, the humanities have. But of course, it's an ambivalent matter, isn't it? I mean, the humanities have the dilemma of humanity parties is that they have been very often the servants of power, but also try to be the critics of them. They know that they are materially the product of the very kind of social order that they attempt to subject to a humane critique. So they're caught up in a kind of inescapable bad faith as far as that goes. Well, it's, you know, a pity, but it needn't matter too much, you know. The problem is to acknowledge their dependence on the context which they're also trying to be a critique of. And that's, of course, a difficult dialectical kind of thing to do. It would be just as much a mistake to see culture as always and unequivocally on the side of domination as it would to be seen as some radical romantic to do as an intrinsically emancipatory force. I think it's neither. Yes?
I was wondering what you think about the fashions of literary criticism, if they track your sort of progress of humanism, or demise of humanism, in the sense of several decades of new historians and cultural studies seems to emphasize the instrumentality of the literature, whereas now we have sort of new aestheticism, new formalism, which seems to be wanting to retreat from that instrumentality in some forms. And with that, do you see that coinciding with your ideas of the humanism as recapturing that kind of romantic?
Well, one of the things wrong with what I said with my talk was that I tended to use the word instrumentality too negatively. I mean, as far as political emancipation goes, there's none without some kind of instrumental ends means rationality. You know, and I slipped into a rather typical patrician humanist disparagement of instrumentality, and your point makes that point very well. One of the running battles on the cultural left, I mean the interesting cultural left, I mean the Bolshevik futurists and the Weimar Republic Brechtians, not, you know, more recently, was precisely, of course, how far should art be instrumental and how far should it resist instrumentality. But roughly speaking, the avant-garde back to the former case, and a kind of left modernism, you know, that and that. Well, I'm pretty kind of feebly fence-sitting when that's concerned. I don't like sitting on fences, but basically, I mean, I think that depends on the situation. There is room for a kind of instrumental art, and there's also room for an art that resists instrumental rationality in its very forms. I think both of these are true. I've not entirely forgotten what you said.
Whether the current sort of fashions in literary criticism are actually, in a way, kind of tracking what you're suggesting is a need to re-embrace a kind of radical romanticism.
Well, you see, one of the virtues of what one might call postmodern culture has been its insistence on a certain kind of integration, has been its refusal of certain obvious forms of cultural elitism and ideas, its insistence on the materiality of culture, and culture as institution, and, you know, alongside and with other institutions. The difficulty is to preserve that emphasis without losing the sense of culture as critique. That's a traditional problem on the left. How then does integration not mean ideological incorporation? My own view about that is that there's no virtue, inherent virtue, either in integration or in separation. It all depends on what you're integrating with or separating from. It's too formalistic, in other words, to suggest that culture and other activities should go together, or they shouldn't. You can try to democratize culture without making it any less dissonant. It doesn't follow that the popularization or democratization of culture necessarily should deprive it of its dissonant force. Speaking essentially of cultural studies, which a friend over here mentioned, we should be very careful in realizing, shouldn't we, in recognizing that the axis of high or canonical by no means coincides with the axis of good and bad. It has been one of the more naive assumptions of some people in the cultural studies area that it does. There's a great deal, put it another way, there's a great deal in the often reviled canon, which is far more politically radical, than anything we're going to find on American television or British television. Far. You think of Blake and Shelley and many other writers, and Mary Wollstonecraft and so on, you're talking about a critique which in its searchingness and depth and capacity is able to survive the elitist situation in which that culture has been placed, which occupies. Similarly, there's no equation between popular and radical, far from it. Populist forms of conservatism are rampant. A populist conservative was just buried in my country last week. So these two axes aren't synonymous, whatever the word is, they're not co-equal. They cut across each other all the time. Yes?
Yeah, maybe it's a silly question, I don't know, but would you please help me to clarify what is your question what is your answer, to your question, so are we going to see the end of the humanities? Because I think that I had some problems in grasping what you were saying, and I would like you to summarize your answer to this question. Is the end of the humanities?
I get more You're right. I didn't actually spell out as much as I should have done. The title, as it were, the question raised in the title. Where I come from, at least not where I live now, but where I was brought up in Britain, the situation is, I think, very bad as far as the humanities goes. I think quite clear that the powers that be really want to get rid of them. They simply don't generate enough income, and they don't have enough point. Sorry?
In Italy, it's the same.
Yeah, that's what I mean. In many ways, it's a global phenomenon, but the degree of crisis differs from one place to another. I don't know enough about the very honourable American tradition of insisting that the humanities should be on a much broader basis. The idea that people should study the humanities anyway, no matter what they're going to end up doing, I think is a wonderful idea, and I want to be defended. But there's no doubt that the government in Britain, and probably if the Labour government follows it, it won't be different, is intent on if not destruction, certainly the marginalisation of the humanities. But already it is not without resistance. I've been involved back there in one or two such events that students have often quite ferociously put up resistance. Right? But of course it is in the logic, let's say, to be a little fatalistic about it, it's in the logic of late capitalism that this should be the case. Capitalism can funds the humanities as it funds the National Health Service when it can afford to do so. And if it can't afford to do so, because greedy bankers have created an almighty crisis, then too bad for the humanities and too bad for the National Health Service. How far, at least there was something to be said for classical capitalism earlier in this century, at least where I come from, Europe and so on. It was able to fund most of the time some kind of social democracy that would palliate its own most vicious effects. That's less and less true, of course, in Britain. It's less and less true where you come from, certainly. It's hardly true at all in Greece. That when capitalism hits a crisis, then those activities will go to the wall without any question. And that's what we're seeing in Europe today. Now, it may be, to revert to the question of hope, that a resurgence in capitalism may once again fund some of these activities. But once you slash them to the bone, it's very hard to restore. You've done something quite momentous and historic, really. And you may well have a vista of the future, endless seminars on vampires, like every English seminar has to be on an stretching to the horizon. Yes.
I resonated strongly with your tragic humanism. And you mentioned it's a kind of humanism that you could die for. And I'm wondering